All right, what's up? I'm back again with Tragedy and Hope. We're on page 225, Military History 1914 to 1918. This is the hype part. This is the real hype part. Okay. For the general student of history, the military history of the First World War is not merely the narration of advancing armies, the struggles of men, their deaths, triumphs, or defeats. Rather, it presents an extraordinary discrepancy between the facts of modern warfare and the ideas on military tactics which dominated the minds of men, especially the minds of military men. This discrepancy existed for many years before the war began to disappear only in the course of 1918. As a result of its existence, the first 3 years of the war witnessed the largest military casualties in human history. These occurred as a result of the efforts of military men to do things which were quite impossible to do. The German victories of 1866 and 1870 were the result of theoretical study, chiefly by the General Staff, and exhaustive, detailed training resulting from that study. They were empathetically not based on experience, for the Army of 1866 had no actual fighting experience for 2 generations and was commanded by a leader, Helmut von Moltke, who had never commanded a unit so large as a company previously. Moltke's great contribution was to be found in the fact that by using the railroad and telegraph, he was able to merge mobilization and attack into a single operation so that the final concentration of his forces took place in the enemy country, practically on the battlefield itself, just before contact with the main enemy forces took place. This contribution of Moltke was accepted and expanded by Count von Schlieffen, chief of the Great General Staff from 1891 to 1905. Schlieffen considered it essential to overwhelm the enemy in one great initial onslaught. He assumed that Germany would be outnumbered and economically smothered in any fighting of extended duration, and sought to prevent this by a lightning war of an exclusively offensive character. The Blitzkrieg. That's what it is, I think, right? Lightning war is Blitzkrieg. No, it's Blitzkrieg. He assumed that the war would be a two-front war against France and Russia simultaneously, and that the former would have to be annihilated before the latter was completely mobilized. Above all, he was determined to preserve the existing social structure of Germany, especially the superiority of the Junker class. Accordingly, he rejected either an enormous mass army in which the Junker control of the officer corps would be lost by simple lack of numbers, or a long-drawn war of resources and attrition which would require a reorganized German economy. The German emphasis on attack was shared by the French Army Command, but in a much more extreme and even mystical fashion. Under the influence of Ardent Dupuy and Ferdinand Foch, the French General Staff came to believe that victory depended only on attack, and the success of any attack depended on morale and not on any physical factors. Dupuy went so far as to insist that victory did not depend at all on physical assaults or on casualties, because the former never occurs and the latter occurs only during flight after defeat. According to him, victory was a matter of morale and went automatically to the side with the higher morale. The sides charged at each other. There is never any shock of attack because one side breaks and flees before impact. This break is not the result of casualties because the flight occurs before casualties are suffered and always begins in the rear ranks where no casualties could be suffered. The casualties are suffered in the flight and pursuit after the break. Thus, the whole problem of war resolved itself into a problem of how to screw up the morale of one's army to the point where it was willing to fling itself headlong on the enemy. Technical problems of equipment or maneuvers are of little importance. These ideas of Dupic were accepted by an influential group in the French army as the only possible explanation of the French defeat in 1870. This group, led by Foch, propagated through the army the doctrine of morale and the offensive outrance. Foch became professor at the École Supérieure de Guerre in 1894, and his teachings could be summed up in 4 words: attaques, attaques, toujours attaques. I guess that just means attack, attack, everybody attack. This emphasis on the offensive outrance by both sides led to a concentration of attention on 3 factors which were obsolete by 1914. These 3 were cavalry, the bayonet, and the headlong infantry assault. These were obsolete in 1914 as a result of 3 technical innovations: A. Rapid-fire guns, especially machine guns; B. Barbed wire entanglements; and C. Trench warfare. The orthodox military leaders generally paid no attention to the 3 innovations while concentrating all their attentions on the 3 obsolete factors. Foch, from his studies of the Russo-Japanese War, decided that machine guns and barbed wire were of no importance and ignored completely the role of trenches. Although cavalry was obsolete for assault by the time of the Crimean War, a fact indicated in Tynninson's The Charge of the Light Brigade, and although this was clearly demonstrated to be so in the American Civil War, a fact explicitly recognized in the Army and Navy Journal for October 31st, 1868. Cavalry and cavalry officers continued to dominate armies and military preparations. During the war of 1914 to 1918, many commanding officers like John French, Douglas Haig, and John J. Pershing were cavalry officers and retained the mentality of such officers. Haig, in his testimony before the Royal Commission on War in South Africa, 1903, testified, "Cavalry will have a larger sphere of action in future wars." Pershing insisted on necessity to keep large numbers of horses behind the lines, waiting for the breakthrough which was to be obtained by bayonet charge. In every army, transportation was one of the weakest points, yet feed for the horses was the largest item transported, being greater than ammunition or other supplies. Although transport across the Atlantic was critically short throughout the war, 1/3 of all shipping space was in feed for horses. Time for training recruits was also a critical bottleneck, but most armies spent more time on bayonet practice than anything else. Yet casualties inflicted on the enemy by bayonet were so few that they hardly appear in the statistics dealing with the subject. The belief of military men that an assault made with high morale could roll through wire, machine guns, and trenches was made even more unrealistic by their insistence that such an offensive unit maintain a straight front. This meant that it was not permitted to move further in a soft spot, but was to hold back where advance was easy in order to break down the defensive strongpoints so that the whole front could proceed at approximately the same rate. This was done, they explained, in order to avoid exposed flanks and enemy crossfire on advanced salients. There was some opposition to these unrealistic theories, especially in German army, and there were important civilians in all countries who fought with their own military leaders on these issues. Clemenceau in France, and above all, Lord Esher, and the members of the Committee on Imperial Defense in England should be mentioned here. The outbreak of the war in August 1914, both sides began to put into effect their complicated strategic plans made much earlier. On the German side, this plan, known as the Schlieffen Plan, was drawn up in 1905 and modified by the younger Helmut von Moltke, nephew of Moltke of 1870, after 1906. On the French side, the plan was known as Plan 17 and was drawn up by Joffre in 1912. The original Schlieffen Plan proposed to hold the Russians as best as could be done with 10 divisions and to face France with a stationary left wing of 8 divisions and a great wheeling right and center of 53 divisions going through Holland and Belgium and coming down on the flank and rear of the French armies by passing west of Paris. Moltke modified this by adding 2 divisions to the right wing, 1 from the Russian front and 1 new, and 8 new divisions to the left. He also cut out the passage through Holland, making it necessary for his right wing to pass through the Liege Gap between Maastricht appendix of Holland and the forested terrain of the Ardennes. The French Plan 17 proposed to stop an anticipated German attack into eastern France from Lorraine and by an assault of 2 enlarged French armies on its center, thus driving victoriously into southern Germany, whose Catholic and separatist peoples were not expected to rally with much enthusiasm to the Protestants' centrist cause of Prussianized German Empire. While this was taking place, a force of 800,000 Russians was to invade East Prussia, and 150,000 British were to bolster the French left wing near Belgium. The execution of these plans did not completely fulfill the expectations of their supporters. The French moved 3,781,000 men and 7,000 trains in 16 days from August 2nd to August 18th, opening their attack on Lorraine on August 14th. By August 20th, they were shattered, and by August 25th, after 11 days of combat, they suffered 300,000 casualties. This was almost 25% of the number of men engaged and represented the most rapid wastage of the war. In the meantime, the Germans in 7 days, August 6th to the 12th, transported 1,500,000 men across the Rhine at the rate of 550 trains per day. These men formed 70 divisions, divided into 7 armies, and forming a vast arc from the northwest to southeast. Within this arc were 49 French divisions organized into 5 armies and the British Expeditionary Force of 4 divisions. The relationship of these forces, the commanding generals of the respective armies, and their relative strength can be seen from the following list. There's a chart on page 229. They got the Entente forces, the German forces, and they're just listing them, and they got some charts here. The German right wing passed Liege without reducing that great fortress on the night of August 6th, 5th through 6th, under the instructions of General Erich Ludendorff of the General Staff. The Belgian army, instead of retreating southwestward before the German wave, moved northwestward to cover Antwerp. This put them ultimately on the rear of the advancing German forces. These forces peeled off 8.5 divisions to reduce the Belgian forts and 7 divisions to cover the Belgian force before Antwerp. This reduced the strength of the German right wing, which was increasingly exhausted by the rapidity of its own advance. When the German plan became clear on August 18th, Joffre formed a new Sixth Army, largely from garrison troops under Michael Joseph Maunuret, I don't know how to pronounce that, but really commanded by Joseph Galinet, military governor of Paris. Military, I guess that's what it is. By August 22nd, the whole French line west of Verdun was in retreat. 3 days later, Moltke, believing victory secure, sent 2 army corps to Russia from the 2nd and 3rd Armies. These arrived on the Eastern Front only after the Russian advance into Prussia had been smashed at Tannenberg and around Marusian Lakes, August 26th to September 15th. In the meantime, in the West, Schleffen's project swept onward to fiasco. When Lanrezac showed up, Bülow's advance on August 29th, Kluck, who was already a day's march ahead of Bülow, tried to close the gap between the two by turning southeastward. This brought his line of advance east of Paris rather than west of that city as originally planned. Galinet, bringing the Sixth Army from Paris and any vehicles he could commandeer, threw it at Kluck's exposed right flank. Kluck turned again to face Gallieni, moving northwestward in a brilliant maneuver in order to envelop him with the German arc before resuming his advance southward. This operation was accompanied by considerable success, except that it opened a gap 30 miles wide between Kuck and Bülow. Opposite this gap was the British Expeditionary Force, which was withdrawing southward with even greater speed than the French. On September 5th, the French retreat stopped. On the following day, they began a general counterattack ordered by Joffre on the insistence of Gallieni. Thus began the First Battle of the Marne. Kluck was meeting with considerable success over the 6th French Army, although Bülow was being badly mauled by Lanrezac when the British Expeditionary Force began to move into the gap between the 1st and 2nd German armies September 9th. A German staff officer, Lieutenant Colonel Hinched, ordered the whole German right to fall back to Ennis River, where a front was formed on September 13th by the arrival of some of the German forces which had been attacking the Belgian forts. The Germans were willing to fall back to Ennis because they believed the advance could be resumed when they wished to do so. In the next few months, the Germans tried to resume their advance, and the French tried to dislodge the Germans from their position. Neither was able to make any headway against the firepower of the other. A succession of futile efforts to outflank each other's positions merely succeeded in bringing the ends of the fronts to the English Channel on one extreme and to Switzerland on the other. In spite of millions of casualties, this line, from the sea to the mountains, across the fair face of France, remained almost unchanged for over 3 years. During these terrible years, the dream of military men was to break through the enemy line by infantry assault, then roll up his flanks and disrupt his rearward communication by pouring cavalry and other reserves through the gap. This was never achieved. The effort to attain it led to one experiment after another. In order, these were bayonet assault, 2. Preliminary artillery barrage, and 3. Use of poison gas, and 4. Use of the tank, 5. Use of infiltration. The last 4 of these innovations were devised alternatively by the Allies and by the Central Powers. Bayonet assault was a failure by the end of 1914. It merely created mountains of dead and wounded without any real advance, although some officers continued to believe that an assault would be successful if the morale of the attackers could be brought to a sufficiently high pitch to overcome machine gun fire. Wow. That's like kind of like Zap Brannigan in Futurama. He's like, I sent wave after wave of my own troops at the killbots until finally the killbots reached their maximum number of kills. I just kept sending wave after wave of my own troops. An artillery barrage as a necessary preliminary to infantry assault was used almost from the beginning. It was ineffectual. At first, no army had the necessary quantity of munitions. Some armies insisted on ordering shrapnel rather than high explosive shells for such barrages. This resulted in a violent controversy between Lloyd George and the generals, the former trying to persuade the latter that shrapnel was not effective against defensive forces in ground trenches. In time, it should have become clear that high explosive barrages were not effective either, although they were used in enormous quantities. They failed because, 1. Earth and concrete fortifications provided sufficient protection to the defensive forces to allow them to use their own firepower against the infantry assault which followed the barrage. 2. A barrage notified the defense where to expect the following infantry assault so that reserves could be brought up to strengthen that position. And 3. The doctrine of continuous front made it impossible to penetrate the enemy position on a wide enough front to break through. The efforts to do so, however, resulted in enormous casualties. At Verdun in 1916, the French lost 350,000 and the Germans 300,000. On the Eastern Front, the Russian general Alexei Brusilov lost 1 million men in an indecisive attack through Galicia, June through August 1916. On the Somme, in the same year, the British lost 410,000, the French lost 190,000, and the Germans lost 450,000 for a maximum gain of 7 miles on the front, about 25 miles wide. July to November 1916. The following year, the slaughter continued. At Chemin des Dames in April 1917, the French, under a new commander, Robert Nivelle, fired 11 million shells in a 10-day barrage on a 30-mile front. The attack failed, suffering losses of 118,000 men in a brief period. Many corps mutinied, and large numbers of combatants were shot to enforce discipline. 23 civilian leaders were also executed. Nivelle was replaced by Pétain. Shortly afterwards, at Passchendaele, the Third Battle of Ypres, Haig used a barrage of 4.25 million shells, almost 5 tons for every yard, in an 11-mile front, but lost 400,000 men in the ensuing assault. August and November 1917. The failure of the barrage made it necessary to devise new methods, but military men were reluctant to try any innovations. In April 1915, the Germans were forced by civilian pressure to use poison gas, as had been suggested by the famous chemist Fritz Haber. Accordingly, without any effort at concealment and with no plans to exploit a breakthrough if it came, they sent a wave of chlorine gas at the place where the French and British lines joined. The junction was wiped out, and a great gap was opened through the line, although it was not closed for 5 weeks. Nothing was done by the Germans to use it. The first use of gas by the Western powers, the British, on September 1915 was no more successful. At the terrible Battle of Passchendaele in July 1917, the Germans introduced mustard gas, a weapon which was copied by the British in July 1918. This was the most effective gas used in the war, but it served to strengthen the defense rather than the offense, and was especially valuable to the Germans in their retreat in the autumn of 1918, serving to slow up the pursuit and making difficult any really decisive blow against them. The tank as an offensive weapon devised to overcome the defensive strength of machine gun fire was invented by Ernest Swinton in 1915. Really? I'm pretty sure Leonardo da Vinci had invented the tank. You can see he has drawings of tanks. I mean, he didn't actually make one, but you can see in some of Leonardo da Vinci's sketches, he sketched out he sketched out a helicopter, a proto helicopter, and also several different types of tanks. So I don't know what they're saying here. Only his personal contacts with the members of the Committee of Imperial Defense succeeded in bringing his ideas to some kind of realization. The suggestion was resisted by the generals. When continued resistance proved impossible, the new weapon was misused, orders for more were canceled, and all military supporters of the new weapon were removed from responsible positions and replaced by men who were distrustful or at least ignorant of tanks. Swinton sent detailed instructions to headquarters, emphasizing that they must be used for the first time in large numbers in a surprise assault without any preliminary artillery barrage and with close support by infantry reserves. Instead, they were used quite incorrectly. While Swinton was still training crews for the first 150 tanks, 50 were taken to France. The commander who had been trained in their use was replaced by an inexperienced man, and a mere 18 were sent against the Germans. This occurred on September 15, 1916, in the waning stages of the Battle of Somme. An unfavorable report on their performance was sent from General Headquarters to the War Office in London, and, as a result, an order for manufacture of thousands more was cancelled without the knowledge of the cabinet. This was overruled only by direct orders from Lloyd George. Only on November 20, 1917, were tanks used as Swinton had instructed. On that day, 318 tanks, supported by 6 infantry divisions, struck the Hindenburg Line before Cambrai and burst through into open country. These forces were exhausted by a 5-mile gain and stopped. The gap in the German line was not utilized, for the only available reserves were 2 divisions of cavalry, which were ineffective. Thus, the opportunity was lost. Only in 1918 were massed tank attacks used with any success and in the fashion indicated by Swinton. The year 1917 was a bad one. The French and British suffered through their greatest disasters at Chemin des Dames and Passchendaele. Romania entered the war and was almost completely overrun, Bucharest being captured on December 5th. Russia suffered a double revolution and was obliged to surrender to Germany. The Italian front was completely shattered by a surprise attack at Caporetto, and only by a miracle was it reestablished along the Piave, October to December 1917. The only bright spots in the year were the British conquest of Palestine and Mesopotamia and the entrance into the War of the United States. but the former was not important and the latter was a promise for the future rather than to help 1917. Nowhere, perhaps, is the unrealistic character of the thinking of most high military leaders of World War I revealed more clearly than in the British Commander-in-Chief, Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig. Scion of a Scottish distillery family. In June 1917, in spite of a decision of May 4th by the Inter-Allied Conference at Paris against any British offensive, and at a time when Russia and Serbia had been knocked out of the war, French military morale was shattered after the fiasco of the Nivelle offensive, and American help was almost a year in the future. Haig determined on a major offensive against the Germans to win the war. He ignored all discouraging information from his intelligence, wiped from the record the known figures about German reserves, and deceived the cabinet both in respect to the situation and to his own plans. Throughout the discussion, the civilian political leaders, who were almost universally despised as ignorant amateurs by the military men, were proved more correct in their judgments and expectations. Haig obtained permission for his Passchendaele offensive only because General William Robertson, chief of the Imperial General Staff, covered up Haig's falsifications about German reserves, and because First Sea Lord Admiral John Jellicoe told the cabinet that unless Haig could capture the submarine bases on the Belgian coast, an utterly impossible objective, he considered it improbable that we could go on with the war next year for lack of shipping. On this basis, Haig won approval for a step-by-step offensive not involving heavy losses. He was so optimistic that he told his generals that opportunities for the employment of cavalry in masses are likely to offer. The offensive opened on July 31st, developed into the most horrible struggle of the war, fought week after week in a sea of mud, with casualties mounting to 400,000 men after 3 months. In October, when the situation had been hopeless for weeks, Haig still insisted that the Germans were at the point of collapse, that their casualties were double the British, they were considerably less than the British, and that the breakdown of the Germans and the opportunity for the tanks and cavalry to rush through them might come at any moment. One of the chief reasons for the failure of these offensives was the doctrine of the continuous front, which led commanders to hold back their offensives where resistance was weak and to throw their reserves against the enemy's strong points. This doctrine was completely reversed by Ludendorff in the spring of 1918 in a new tactic known as infiltration. By this method, advance was to be made around strong points by penetrating as quickly as possible and with maximum strength through weak resistance, leaving the centers of strong resistance surrounded and isolated for later attention. Although Ludendorff did not carry out this plan with sufficient conviction to give full success, he did achieve amazing results. The great losses by the British and French in 1917 added to the increase in German strength from forces arriving under the defunct Russian and Romanian fronts made it possible for Ludendorff to strike a series with sledgehammer blows along the Western Front between Douai and Verdun in March and April of 1918. Finally, on May 27th, after a brief but overwhelming bombardment, the German flood burst over Chemins des Dames, poured across the Anisne, and moved relentlessly towards Paris. By May 30th, it was on the Marne, 37 miles from the capital. There, in the Second Battle of the Marne, were reenacted the events of September 1914. On June 4th, the German advance was stopped temporarily by a 2nd American Division at Chateau Thierry. In the next 6 weeks, a series of counterattacks aided by 9 American divisions were made on the northern flank of German penetration. The Germans fell back behind the Vesle River, military intact, but so ravaged by influenza that many companies had only 30 men. The Crown Prince demanded that the war be ended. Before this could be done, on August 8, 1918, the Black Day of the German Army, as Ludendorff called it, the British broke the German lines at Amiens by a sudden assault with 456 tanks, supported by 13 infantry and 3 cavalry divisions. When the Germans rushed up 18 reserve divisions to support the 6 which were attacked, the Allied powers repeated their assault at St. Quentin, August 31st, and in Flanders, September 2nd. A German Crown Council meeting at Spa decided that victory was no longer possible, but neither civil government nor army leaders would assume the responsibility for opening negotiations for peace. The story of these negotiations will be examined in a moment as the last of a long series of diplomatic conversations which continued throughout the war. Looking back on the military history of the First World War, it is clear that the whole war was a siege operation against Germany. Once the original German onslaught was stopped on the Marne, victory for Germany became impossible because she could not resume her advance. On the other hand, the Entente powers could not eject the German spearhead from French soil, although they sacrificed millions of men and billions of dollars in the effort to do so. Any effort to break in on Germany from some other front was regarded as futile and was made difficult by the continuing German pressure in France. Accordingly, although sporadic attacks were made on the Italian front, in the Arab areas of the Ottoman Empire, on the Dardanelles directly in 1915 against Bulgaria through Saloniki in 1915 to 1918, and along the whole Russian front, both sides continued to regard northeastern France as the vital area, and in that area, clearly no decision could be reached. To weaken the German Entente powers began a blockade of the Central Powers controlling the sea directly, in spite of the indecisive German naval challenge at Jutland in 1916 and limiting the imports of neutrals near Germany, like the Netherlands. To resist this blockade, Germany used a four-pronged instrument. On the home front, every effort was made to control economic life so that all goods would be used in the most effective fashion possible, and so that food, leather, and other necessities would be distributed fairly to all. The success of this struggle on the home front was due to the ability of 2 German Jews. Haber, the chemist, devised a method for extracting nitrogen from the air, and thus obtained an adequate supply of the most necessary constituent of all fertilizers and all explosives. Before 1914, the chief source of nitrogen had been in guano deposits of Chile, and, but for Haber, the British blockade would have compelled a German defeat in 1915 from lack of nitrates. Walter Ranthau, director of the German Electric Company and of some 6 other companies, organized the German economic system in a mobilization which made it possible for Germany to fight on with slowly dwindling resources. On the military side, Germany made a threefold reply to British blockade. It tried to open the blockade by defeating its enemies to the south and east, Russia and Romania and Italy. In 1917, this effort was largely successful, but it was too late. Simultaneously, Germany tried to wear down her Western foes by a policy of attrition in the trenches and to force Britain out of the war by retaliatory submarine blockade directed at British shipping. The submarine attack, as a new method of naval warfare, was applied with hesitation and ineffectiveness until 1917. Then it was applied with such ruthless efficiency that almost 1,000,000 tons of shipping was sunk in the month of April 1917, and Britain was driven within 3 weeks of exhaustion of her food supply. This danger of a British defeat, dressed in the propaganda clothing of moral outrage at inequity of submarine attacks, at the iniquity. Okay, hold up. This danger of a British defeat, dressed in the propaganda clothing of moral outrage at the iniquity of submarine attacks, brought the United States into the war on the side of the Entente in that critical month of April 1917. In the meantime, the German policy of military attrition on the Western Front worked well until 1918. By January of that year, Germany had been losing men at about half her rate of replacement and at about half the rate at which she was inflicting losses on the Entente powers. Thus, the period 1914 to 1918 saw a race between the economic attrition of Germany by the blockade and the personal attrition of the Entente by military action. This race was never settled on its merits because 3 new factors entered the picture in 1917. These were the German counter-blockade by submarines on Britain, the increase in German manpower in the West resulting from her victory in the East, and the arrival on the Western Front of new American forces. The first 2 of these factors were overbalanced in the period of March to September 1918, and by the third, what did it say? The first 2 of these factors were overbalanced in the period March through September 1918. By the third, by August 1918, Germany had given her best, and it had not been adequate. The blockade and the rising tide of American manpower gave the German leaders the choice to surrender or complete economic and social upheaval. Without exception, led by the Junker military commanders, they chose surrender. Okay, so that's page 236. The next section is going to be diplomatic history, 1914 to 1918. That sounds even more exciting. But I mean, basically, what it seems like happened there was, they started out doing regular, kind of like the old school, like lining up the troops and just marching across the fields. And then once people invented machine guns, that didn't work. So then they had to basically hide in the trenches, and the trenches made it impossible for either side to win because they were just both playing defense. And so even though they could bomb the trenches and do all this other stuff, as soon as they tried to advance past the trench, they couldn't because there was too many people in the trench, and they could just keep calling reserves into the trench. And it's such a good defensive position where all you have to do is just shoot. You don't even really have to aim. All you have to do is just keep shooting, and if they're trying to advance and you just keep shooting at them, you're going to hit somebody, and it's hard for them to hit you in the trenches. So then they tried using chlorine gas and mustard gas, which killed a lot of people in the trenches, but then it made it impossible to cross that area because it was full of poison gas. Then they tried using tanks. At first, they didn't use a proper strategy because some guy was in a rush to use the tanks. Then eventually, they kind of figured out how to use the tanks, but by then, it was just too late, and they were in like a stalemate. Basically, Germany had a little bit of France. The Allied powers were moving into Germany, so basically Germany surrendered instead of getting like completely destroyed. So that's what we read so far. Kind of interesting. I mean, if you watch the movie All Quiet on the Western Front, it's an older movie, but I think it might be on YouTube. That kind of really shows you what the whole trench warfare stuff was like, and how, you know, they were throwing the gas in, and, you know, as long as you didn't go over the trench, you were pretty good. But if you went over the trench, you get roasted. So yeah, check that movie out if you want to like visualization of what was going on in that time period. There might be some other good movies too, but that's the one I saw. So all right, I'm gonna get out of here for now. I'll probably be back later. Until then, peace.